Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this Thursday afternoon. Today, we're here to present a RISE Masterclass on procurement. And procurement's a tricky topic. It's, one that's critical to project success and organisation success, but it's one that trips everyone up so often. And often that's from maybe a lack of understanding and a lack of planning in terms of, setting out timescales and getting the key documents and information together. I think today we've got a mixture of local authorities, housing providers, and suppliers, representing contractors and service providers through the supply chain. So I'll try and skin this on both ways, really, and, explain, how it works for the client side and how it can also work for the supply chain side as well, because obviously procurement is a two-pronged piece. And ultimately, we're looking at having something that meets in the middle so that a supplier can deliver something that the client wants to satisfactory standards. So in terms of today's agenda, these are sort of key talking points. We're going to understand, what procurement is, look at some of the principles of good procurement, talk about some of the procurement routes that currently exist. And then I'm just going to run through some of the key updates from the Procurement Act 2023. You may notice it's 2025, so it's a few years late, but that one's coming into force very soon. And then we'll talk about procurement and social value, which ties very nicely into the Warm Homes funding scheme requirements as well. So please ask any questions in the chat or hold on to them until after, and we'll have lots of chance for questions and answers. And hopefully, share some of your thoughts and your experiences from organisations that deal with procurement and benefit from procurement as well. So first and foremost then, what is procurement? I mean, I think we probably all understand, but sometimes it's just good to go back to, what the definition is. So in terms of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, CIPS, they define it as the buying of goods and services that enable an organisation to operate in a profitable and ethical manner. But let's, delve into this function in a bit more detail. So procurement is around really securing necessary resources to sustain an organisation or support its operations. And this can happen through various channels. So it could be such as participating in framework agreements, something that we'll talk about in a bit, or it could be you issue direct tenders for specific products or pieces of work or services that you need in order to sustain your organisation or support its operation. And behind all of procurement is something called the MEAT principle. MEAT stands for the most economically advantageous principle. Sorry, most economically advantageous tender. And it's a principle that doesn't really have any rigid rules dictating it. So when it comes to economic advantageous, there's no sort of definition of what that means. And what it actually means is it depends on factors like the procurement subject matter and your organisation's objectives. So it's about balancing quality and price to make it advantageous to what your organisation is trying to achieve. So it's looking beyond just cost, and that's where the overall principles of advantageous tender come in. And it considers other factors such as, training. Does the supplier offer training or skills development? Things like local employment, working with local SMEs and local contractors, can the contractor create jobs within the local community? It might be around life cycle costs, assessing long-term expenses and running costs, not just the upfront prices. It might be about long-term environmental impact, that whole life cycle carbon impact. In terms of understanding the overall eco-friendly option, not something that's just tagged as eco-friendly on the price tag. But what we're actually going to see through the Procurement Act, which, as I mentioned, that the introduction is a couple of years late, but it's coming in very soon, is a transition from MEAT to MAT. So we're now going to be moving to the most advantageous tender. So price remains important, but that economic focus is being removed from the principle of the approach. Flexibility allows the organisation to consider additional elements, but MAT recognises that value extends beyond price. It's about embracing a holistic view of what truly matters to that organisation. So obviously, historically, we've seen procurement and tenders focusing on cost and quality and putting splits on that. And that's always been varied depending on organisations. But now, through the new Procurement Act, the maths approach will give a much more holistic view for individual organisations to decide what's important to them. So in terms of principles of good procurement, there's, the real key principle of good procurement is to procure via a competitive process, tender, ensuring you get some prices back so you can compare quality and cost. But actually, that's not always essential. There are certain routes to market without a tender, and it doesn't always give value for money in terms of procurement. But ultimately, the principles of procurement are trying to test value for money through a competitive process. And we also want to follow key rules and regulations. So for public sector and social landlords, we've mentioned previously the meet concept, but there's also additional rules and regulations and best practice that needs to be considered. So, need to consider how to go to market, how to engage with suppliers. All of these are contained within the PCR regulations. And the regulations explain why clients can't just select certain suppliers or certain products based on existing relationships, what's gone before, conversations you've had in the pub, with a certain supplier. It's about making sure it's a much more ethical and fair process. But we mentioned about the transition to MAT and cost and VFM being still a key driver for public sector clients. It's also about demonstrating property and good practice. So this relates to conflicts of interest, anti-bribery, fraud. All of these issues are key drivers for individual organisations to make sure that they've got their standards and propriety and good practice in place. And it might be that organisations also have additional standing orders and procurement rules. So, for example, you may have specific rules in your organisation that mean that if a contract exceeds a certain value, it needs to be advertised in local and national press. It may be that if a project exceeds a tender price of a certain value, you need to get X number of quotes back. So procurement and the principles of good procurement for public bodies is about meeting the national regulation, demonstrating a competitive process, but also still complying with your own individual organisational processes. And from a client perspective, obviously, this can drive challenge and time delays. And from a contractor and supply chain perspective, this can lead to challenges and additional work in terms of trying to meet some of those requirements. So it's just good to understand what those key drivers and principles are at the start of the procurement process. And we've mentioned a couple of the public procurement regulations. The one that you'll all be familiar with and that you're all currently following is the Public Contracts Regulation 2015. And this is going to be replaced on the 24th of February with the Procurement Act 2023. So PCR 2015 isn't retroactive, so existing procurement should continue to follow PCR 2015. So if something's already in place, that will still continue to follow those regulations. Anything that's brand new from the 24th of February, which for a lot of organisations on this call today might be things related to your Warm Homes Social Fund or your Warm Homes Local Grant projects, a lot of those will end up following the new Procurement Act routes, which offer different challenges, but new opportunities for the supply chain as well. And we're going to cover that in a bit. So through procurement routes then, there's four main types of procurement through the PCR 2015, and we've described these as open procedure, restricted procedure, competitive dialogue, and negotiated procedure. And there are others too. There's things such as innovation partnerships, but these are sort of really niche, complex, and very lengthy processes that take a lot of time and a lot of resource time in terms of bringing the skills and expertise together in organisations to deliver these. And to be fair, things like innovation partnerships aren't necessarily relevant to retrofit, so we'll just park that one for today and focus on what we see on the screen. But actually, what we see on the screen isn't necessarily relevant to retrofit. The only two that we probably see most commonly with retrofit is the open procedure and the restricted procedure. Timescales related to funding programs, especially public funding programs related to retrofit, often mean that the open procurement route is the most common type. This is often related to the need to be reactive and to be able to manage that procurement process quickly. Through the open procurement route, individual organisation standing orders So, e.g., what I mentioned before, that threshold for taking it out to national or regional advertising may vary the open procedure slightly, but normally the open procedure is the typical route. So what this is where buyers advertise an invitation to tender and suppliers respond by a set date. And then those submissions are evaluated in line with a predefined methodology. And as I mentioned earlier on, that's a split between cost and quality, and that split is communicated when it goes out to tender. And the position we're in at the moment with the Warm Homes Funding Programme is, I imagine a lot of people on this call did a lot of work before Christmas to get your bids in. You'd maybe put some sizable bids in, and hope to be able to deliver those, but you may be reluctant to follow that procurement exercise until you've got some confidence that you will have that grant funding allocated to you. So what that often means is that we end up getting notice of grant funding, and then we've got organisations scrabbling to procure and find contractors, delivery partners to actually install the measures, and all the service providers to, deliver the services and the trust mark lodgements. So that's where the open procedure is often the most popular for retrofit because it's the most reactive. A more proactive approach is the restricted procedure, and this is a two-stage process which involves a PQQ. So that's a pre-qualification questionnaire where you're asking some key questions around experience and an idea of relevance and case studies in a particular field. And then you follow that up to a certain selected group with an invitation to tender. Now, given the timescales of the funding programmes, it can be difficult to follow restricted procedures in this because clearly it's got two stages, so it's a bit longer, and I've got a slide to demonstrate that in a bit. But what we often see is for more proactive organisations, there might be sort of establishing relationships with suppliers to have a 5 to 10 year strategic delivery partner relationship. So that organisation will deliver their retrofit works or their investment works, changing kitchens and bathrooms for a very long contract period. And that's where that restricted procedure will often come in. But procurement routes all depend on if there actually is a need to go to market. So there is an opportunity where you might have existing contracts which can be extended or amended to allow schemes such as the Warm Homes Fund or previously, SHGF and HUG to be wrapped up in them. And we did see that a lot in SHGF and HUG with existing arrangements being legally extended by grant recipients. So it meant that they could continue rolling out delivery with established contractors that they've already got a relationship with, and they've already got, an understanding of how they work and how well they can deliver. So that is something that can be explored in terms of the individual contracts you've got in place and, advice that you can take from your own procurement teams. Now, what we haven't mentioned on this slide is frameworks and dynamic purchasing systems, DPSs. These are both really common routes to market, but they're not actually a type of procurement, a route to market. They're procured via these routes to market and offer a different solution to buyers, but they are really useful for getting grant funded projects speedily delivered and getting contractors and supply chain on board to support the delivery of that. So what we can have a quick look at is frameworks and DPSs in their existing form through PTR 2015. So a framework is a pre-procured pool of suppliers. And you can also have single supplier frameworks that also exist. So there might just be one supplier on a framework. Frameworks can be good and bad. So if a framework's been well managed, so all frameworks have a framework managing company, and if they are well managed by that organisation and they've been well procured with creativity when it was set up, then it can benefit the supply chain. So if it's been really thought out about what do we really want to achieve from this framework, what are the measures we want to deliver, what's the quality we're looking for, and what are the key areas that we want to be delivering in, then they can work. But equally so, if frameworks aren't well set up, they can often sit on the shelf, squandered, and really suffer and not deliver any benefit to the organisations that have applied to be on the framework and clients that are looking for speedy solutions by using framework routes. Frameworks do mean that you've got potentially a small number of companies competing for the same work, which means that costs can become competitive and pens and pencils need to be sharpened, which is great for clients, but more challenging for supply chain. It's about, how low can you go with those numbers while still trying to deliver that quality. But one of the more frustrating things about frameworks is that they do become locked in. So they open and then they close. And then when they close, they've got that pre-defined group of framework suppliers on the framework. And that means it's locked out and no one else can come into that framework. That can be often for up to 4 years. So in the world of retrofit, if you think about where we are now with this massive new funding stream about to go live, if we've got new suppliers who are wanting to deliver local grant or social housing fund, and there's a framework that's just closed, it means that they're not going to be able to access any of that work, which is a shame in terms of what the government's trying to achieve in terms of supporting new entrants and SMEs and really trying to grow the supply chain. But frameworks do benefit because they do allow for direct awards or mini competitions. So that means that frameworks can either have direct awards carried out to contractors, and direct awards do bring pros and cons to them as well. So a mini competition call-off allows for rates to be updated, specifications to be slightly varied, maybe as technology's moved on. It allows for updates to happen to make it much more live. A direct award means that you're working on predefined rates and predefined specifications, and it means that market conditions versus current conditions aren't always reflected in a direct award. Frameworks can be fast, and they also can be cheap. But one of the benefits of frameworks is they can build on lessons learned. So, for example, we might find that the framework management organisation communicates with the contractors and the suppliers on their framework to understand where issues are. So it might be that specifications aren't clear, the detailing of contractual requirements isn't clear, and a well-managed framework can start to amend the documentation to start improving the process in the future, which means that all parties benefit. The client gets the outcome they want by getting a more reflective framework price and framework quality from all the contractors that are on board. So frameworks, are a well-established route and something that really does support delivery of energy efficiency, retrofit, and to be fair, a lot of key housing maintenance work as well. But we've also got something called the Dynamic Purchasing System, a DPS. And DPS is different. So I mentioned in the previous slide, frameworks are open and then they close and then you're locked out. The good news is a DPS is always open. So it always means that new entrants and new bodies can enter and ultimately benefit from the opportunity that's out there in terms of all this work. So the good news is that a DPS allows more competition. Obviously, if you keep allowing new people to come in, it means you've got a bit more activity and a bit more market challenge. But increased competition does add increased complexity. So maybe in a framework, you might have 5 suppliers on a particular framework, let's say for installation of external wall insulation. Through a DPS, you might end up with 20 or 25, 30, 35 contractors all on that EWI scheme. And that means that a DPS, if all 25, 30 or 35 contractors respond to tenders, that means all of those tender responses have to be reviewed and analysed and scored. And obviously this means there's a lot more administration, a lot more length of time requirement, resource requirements, and ultimately protracted evaluation. The other slight challenge with a DPS, or it can be a benefit depending on which side of the coin you're on, whereas frameworks can allow direct awards, DPSs always need mini competition, which means going to the market and evaluating those market responses. So that ties in with what we said before around, those 25 to 30 responses. But you can't just direct award, it always has to go to market. So there is always that additional time and that additional role that needs to be built into evaluating those. But for supply chain, that means there's always an opportunity to contend and compete for that work. The good news is that DPSs are much more beneficial for smaller organisations, SMEs and local contractors. One of the key reasons for this is to get on DPSs, it's about demonstrating that you meet minimum requirements. So, it's having sort of minimum compliance documents, demonstrating of minimum threshold turnover, etc. And that's the good news. Suppliers and contractors can then get on the DPS and have the opportunity to bid for any work that's out there. But obviously, if work does become available through it and tenders start to be issued through the DPS, That means there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done once you're on it in terms of submitting the tenders, tender responses, and making sure you're in with a chance to win it. So it's a two-headed, sort of a two-sided coin there, sorry, in terms of you can get on it easily, but there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done. And if there's more and more entrants coming into the DPS, it means that challenge of being the most competitive supplier, evaluating which is the most competitive contractor for your work, becomes even more challenging. DPSs are typically great for emerging markets, which retrofit is one of those. It allows for new companies, new approaches, new technologies to be factored into these DPS procurement routes. But ultimately, over time, you'd want to see DPS activity being replaced through a more regular framework type approach to provide a bit more consistency and ultimately allow for that easier direct award approach. So that hopefully just summarizes maybe what's more familiar in terms of how either as a client you're currently procuring your work, or as a contractor you might see the opportunities coming to you, or you might not see them because you can't access these yet. And when we just look at the process involved in tendering, it can get complex. You can see here we've got an example of the two-stage process, the PQQ and the ITT process. So we've got 11 stages here. So 11 stages mean a lot of time. So, it starts at the very start in terms of defining the requirement, making sure you've got enough resources in-house to develop a procurement team that can adequately resource it. That's developing all the upfront documentation and then doing all the evaluation as well. You need to check with the market if there is actually, a market there and a procurement approach that's, relevant for this. Is there anybody actually going to respond to it? Or are you flogging a dead horse by following a certain route? And then before you even need to start anything, you need to have all the documentation complete and ready. You don't want to be doing this on the hoof halfway through. So you need to have your PQQ, your ITT, all your evaluation documents and your decision-making criteria set out up front, so that once the process starts running, you can see it through to completion without any challenges in between. And then you can see all the way through, we've got lots of steps that need to be taken. So the key elements to consider in any procurement process are resources, time frame, availability to either review or to submit, depending on which side of the fence you're on as a client or supplier. There's an awful lot of work involved. And equally so, the open procedure, which is the route we typically see more through energy efficiency projects, that still has 8 stages. It just ditches the PQQ stage, but there's still an awful lot of work involved in this as well. So I think the key here is just to flag, the amount of time that's needed. And with a large amount of projects potentially coming to the market very soon, it's about factoring these thoughts into your organisation's thinking about when should we get started? When is the best time to start thinking about which route do we want to take? Which regulation do we need to follow, for example? And in terms of key documents, regardless of whether it's PCR 2015 or the new Procurement Act, you're going to have some of these key documents to support the journey that you're on. So as a client, you're going to have to prepare these, and as a contractor, supply chain, you're going to have to respond to these. So first of all, you've got the ITT, and this is about being as clear and providing as much information as possible about what's required and how that links to the wider organisational objectives. You need to provide the mechanics of the process, in terms of what is actually needed by delivering this project, and make sure that you've got a clear definition of what you're trying to achieve in terms of specific outputs, quantities, quality, added social value, etc., as this will make it much more appealing to suppliers and reduces risk in terms of additional on-costs when contractors are in contract and the price of something that was very speculative and unclear, and it suddenly comes back to haunt everyone because you realise you've asked the wrong thing at the start, and we now need to do a contract amendment to get back on track. Quality questions are really key to carrying out some of this assessment, especially if we're moving towards that principle. We're moving away from that economically advantageous to just advantageous. So in terms of quality, again, we need to be specific in terms of what type of quality questions you need to ask. It needs to relate to the organisation's aims and objectives, but it also needs to detail exactly what the supplier can do. So with this, you need to think about what weighting needs to be considered. So let's, for example, you might be asking lots of information around how a contractor can support apprenticeships, social value, provide local SMEs opportunities to work on the contract. That will give the contractor, the supplier, opportunity to respond to that. But you need to make sure as a client that the waiting for that question adequately reflects the importance of that activity in terms of your waiting and decision-making procedure. Quality questions should make it easy for the contractor to respond to in terms of specific information, and it should also then make it easier to manage throughout the contract. So if you understand, what the quality questions have asked, and the contractor is clear in terms of what you're asking for, it's been defined at the contract stage, it's been defined at tender, and therefore you can start to report and contract manage based on what has been set out on that tender submission. And tying into that is a specification. So quality is one thing, but the specification is where it gets down to the real nitty-gritty. And specification doesn't just need to talk about things, as in items and, products and so on. It can also reflect behaviours as well. So, specification could say, we don't want any, radios on site between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. And we don't want contractors to be doing X, Y, and Z. So it's about, detailing what behaviours you want to see in terms of the work that you want to deliver. But specifications can deliver performance-based outcomes as well. So it might be that, you say we want a sort of quantity-based outcome. We want 1,000 windows installed. But you might also have a performance-based outcome that says, we want a heat pump with a seasonal performance of 350% based on a flow temperature of 55 degrees. So you need to think about how that specification is set out, which benefits you as a client, and then it allows the contractor from a supply chain's perspective to understand what they need to price for and whether they can actually provide that through their skills and experience. And it might be that you can be more specific on certain things. So you might say, we want copper pipe and not plastic push-fit pipes. So it's a chance for you to really detail your specific needs. In terms of commercial documents, these should give an idea about how the contract will be managed, but it shouldn't be so granular to put suppliers off. So how granular does pricing need to go? Is it down to we want X number of widgets, a widget being a tiny little thing as part of this contract? Or is it about we want to know the cost of the system, which includes, those widgets as part of the key component? So it's about you trying to define what's important to you and obviously understanding how and what can be priced up. If you ask for too granular, it will start to become very difficult for the supply chain to price it, and it will also become less appealing. There might be an easier contract down the road that the same contractor could price up and go and win with much less work. So it's about, thinking rationally in terms of what you're trying to achieve. The form of contract needs to be communicated at the start of the project. It should be appropriate to the type of work being tendered. And it needs to communicate key things, not just in terms of, what the expectations are, but also it should start detailing penalties, for example, for non-delivery, non-compliance, etc. as well. So, the risk of non-delivery can be considered, and a cost-benefit analysis from the supplier can be undertaken to understand whether this is something they want to enter into. We've put another document on here as well, which is specific to private sector schemes, and these are householder agreements. So where we've got local authorities delivering public funded retrofit, they just basically administer the grant and there's no relationship there after the grant's gone out the door. That relationship all sits between the person in the house and the contractor who delivered the work. So householder agreements are really key in private sector schemes to be communicated at tender stage, as this allows the buyer to step back once the works are completed and protect the householder. But again, the purchaser, the supplier, needs to understand exactly what they're buying into so they can start considering the implications of that. And obviously this looks at latent defects, warranty claims, the potential costs associated with that work. So a lot of what we've spoken about so far focuses on the existing PCR 2015 regulation, but I have alluded a few times now to the Procurement Act 2023, and the new Act will go live on the 24th of February 2025. So it's as exciting a time as it can be for procurement. I'm sure, there's some procurement specialists who will be very excited about this. For a lot of people, it's left a bit of head scratching in terms of, what is the difference and what does it really mean? So what the Procurement Act is looking at is making it much more beneficial for suppliers to include more standardisation and streamlining of procurement processes. But there's also additional benefits in the Act, such as requiring better oversight of decision making in terms of, why did that person get that? And also strengthening payment terms, especially to protect those SMEs so they're getting paid in a timely manner when they might not have much cash flow to support large programs and delayed payments from local authorities and housing associations. So it's looking at doing a few key things. So it's looking at introducing a bit more flexibility. So it's going to do this by simplifying the bid processes to make it easier for suppliers to bid, to negotiate and to work in partnership with public sector. And this is going to introduce a new competitive flexible procedure. I'll talk about that in a bit. It's going to look at making commercial frameworks more open, so prospective suppliers are not shut out for long periods of time. So I was talking a bit ago about how frameworks might close, for 4 years, you missed it by one day, you've missed the opportunity to be on that for 4 years. It's looking at trying to adapt that slightly to make it fairer. And it's looking at removing bureaucratic barriers to smaller businesses so that they can compete for more contracts. So, that's to make sure they can actually have the opportunity to win, but again, to make sure that they've got strength and provision for prompt cash flow payments throughout the contract to give them confidence that this is a contract they can deliver. Because, some of these sizable contracts are very challenging for SMEs to deliver. And there is a concern around, profitability and cash flow. If that guarantee of regular payment that removes some of that risk. There's also a focus on greater transparency through a central digital platform. So the new Act will make it easier for contractors to find and bid for contracts. And that'll be done through a new central digital platform, which is a bit of an enhancement to the existing Find a Tender service. So there's already something out there where contractors can go and find work, but this is going to be new and improved. So it's going to feature a simpler registration approach. It's going to have ability for suppliers to store core business details, which you can then, recycle and reuse for multiple bids. So you don't have to keep entering the same thing again and again. And it's going to enable contractors and suppliers to manage and update core information quickly and share that with contracting authorities. So it's going to allow you to be much more responsive in terms of responding to opportunities and having that ongoing dialogue with contracting authorities in the future. And in terms of greater oversight, there's going to be a new procurement review unit, a PRU, set up to enhance public sector procurement practice by ensuring that there is adherence to the Procurement Act and safeguarding public procurement from suppliers deemed to pose risk. So obviously we mentioned about, standing orders and processes that local authorities and housing providers already have in-house. And a lot of this is to reinforce existing regulations. But there's also going to be something set up externally through the PRU, which will do that from an external purpose, which will also make sure suppliers are being protected, but also clients are being protected where there is evidence of suppliers who are breaching some of the regulations. And again, there's also going to be a focus on late payment matters in there as well. So it sounds, quite granular in terms of detail, but it's really about opening up the sector and making it much more opportunistic for local suppliers to become involved in delivery of all works. But in terms of what we're talking about today, we're talking about delivering retrofit through public funded grant programs mainly. So you might be thinking, well, that sounds, potentially good, but I'm not quite sure what I need to do in terms of which act to follow. I mean, the first advice I'd give would be to double check the regulations, there's details in there, and we'll drop some links in the chat at the end. Also speak to your procurement specialist in your organisation. But what we've got here is a little flowchart, which ultimately I can summarise in a couple of bullet points. So if you haven't started to do anything yet on your procurement activity for a project, and you haven't started to do it by before the 24th of February, then follow the Act. So if you're thinking about procuring for your Warm Homes Local Grant or Social Housing Fund, and you're going to start that in April, from a standing start, that will all go through the new route. If you've already started via a framework, a DPS, or another form of qualification system, follow the existing regime used by that framework and DPS. So they'll advise you in terms of which route you need to follow. You may have already issued a notice inviting tenders, etc. And if you've already started to make, the market aware that you've got a project out there, and that's happened before the 24th of February, you follow PCR 2015. If you've not done anything about that notice and you're going to issue it on the 1st of March, you then follow the Act. So, that 24th of February isn't a clear line. There is a few nuances there, but again, the detail is in the government guidance on that as well. So, quick chat about some of the changes to the frameworks that we mentioned before. This could benefit a lot of suppliers, and it could potentially benefit clients as well in terms of making some of the frameworks a bit more beneficial for both parties. So open frameworks have been introduced in the Act as a more flexible alternative to existing framework arrangements. So the open framework is a scheme of successive frameworks for the same goods, services or works based on pretty much the same terms. So what this means is that open frameworks are going to be reopened. So what this means is you'll have one framework in the scheme, which expires as the next one commences, periodically throughout the term, which will allow new suppliers to tender for a place on the framework. And the framework must be reopened at least once during a 3-year period from award of the first framework, and at least within a period of 5 years, beginning on the award of the second framework. So if we think about where we are in warm homes delivery, we're talking, up to 3 years delivery for some of these programs. So there's going to be opportunities, hopefully, for new entrants to frameworks based on the new PCR regulations. So as projects start to deliver in new geographical areas, we have maybe tier 1 contractors looking for new local subcontractors in certain areas. There could be opportunities through the framework route. So this means you're going to be able to retest the market and refresh the supplier base when market conditions change as well. Suppliers who are new entrants to the market will have the ability to join the open framework, and there'll be an improved value for money opportunity through maintaining level of competition through bringing new suppliers in. So it means that frameworks won't go stale with the same pricing mechanisms and the same suppliers offering the same things. There's going to be a bit of disruption there by new entrants coming in and hopefully bringing new ways of working, new products and new efficiencies as part of their approach. We've also got the dynamic markets. So the Act has introduced a new commercial tool known as dynamic markets, which is similar to DPSs in that they're a list of qualified suppliers who are able to participate in future procurement. But whereas DPSs were often focused on emerging and niche markets, the idea about a dynamic market is it can become a much more overarching activity that covers a wider, commonly used goods and services. So a DPS might have been very niche, focusing on a certain technology or a certain retrofit measure. Dynamic market might allow that all to be bundled together under, fabric improvements, for example, rather than a DPS to focus on loft insulation. So there's going to be some different opportunities that come from that. Dynamic market's going to offer greater flexibility to, provide that wider range of goods and services, and it will mean that new suppliers can obviously continue to be added through the lifetime because it's a DPS effectively, and there'll be no restrictions on the term or the number of suppliers that can be part of that dynamic market. So it's great news that it means there's no limit. But do you remember what we said at the start? That means that if everybody responds to that tender, you're going to have to evaluate all those tenders as well. So it could mean that you've got an awful lot of work coming, depending on how you use the DPSs, the dynamic markets. Okay, so one of the things we can't ignore when it comes to public sector procurement is social value. It's a massive aspect of what local authorities, what housing providers are trying to achieve, and ultimately what the government are trying to achieve through the warm homes funding. So social value is important for the supply chain and for clients, but for the supply chain, it can really enhance competitive advantage. So it can increase chances of winning tenders by meeting procurement requirements that prioritise social value. It can meet buyers' expectations for broader social, economic and environmental impacts. It can drive better project outcomes, so it can improve project success rates through stronger community support and stakeholder engagement, build trust and positive relationships. It can help to support sustainable supply chains. So, it's much more about thinking about the local economies through local hiring and sourcing. And then through that local hiring and sourcing, it means there's a local upskilling of the workforce. And hopefully through that local upskilling, it sort of gives a sense of greater ownership in the local area, which can enhance quality and capacity in the supply chain. It can help reduce risks and boost reputation. Obviously, there's opportunities to align with ESG, environmental and social governance targets, and it can showcase ethical and sustainable practices. So it's a chance for you as a client and contractors to shout about, what they're doing to support the wider ambitions, whether it's about addressing fuel poverty, addressing overall poverty, supporting skills, supporting school leavers. It's a chance for you to really think about what's important and try and communicate that through the ITT and the specification and the quality questions to make sure the supplier who's responding can try and respond to some of these key social value requirements. And the supply chain, whether that's contractors, retrofit installers, service providers, procurement teams, they all play a crucial role in delivering social value. And we've talked about that on the previous slide. That's about employing the local workforce, sourcing local materials, engaging and reinvesting in the local community and measuring that as well. That's one of the key things in terms of measuring that local pound impact, looking at collaboration and transparency in terms of, how organisations can work together and how they can demonstrate the impacts of what they've achieved. And that all ties into where we're going with procurement and the Warm Homes schemes. So let's just have a quick look at the Warm Homes funding schemes. So there's 2 government-funded Warm Homes grant schemes. I'm sure you're all aware of these, but just as a quick recap, there's the Warm Homes Social Housing Fund Wave 3, which focuses purely on social housing. And there's 2 application routes, the Challenge Fund and Strategic Partnerships. That one closed, was at the end of November, I think, or the end of October, I can't remember the dates now. And then we've got the Warm Homes Local Grant, which focuses on private sector housing, and that one closed a couple of weeks after the Social Housing Fund. And there are different grant intricacies and different grant requirements relevant to each fund, so you can find more on those links around the specific requirements and the guidance documents that are linked in there as well. But when we think about procurement and Warm Homes funding, there are some details in that guidance about what DESNZ and the government, and therefore you, are trying to deliver through these funding programmes. So for the Social Housing Fund, some of the key areas that DESNZ have highlighted: supporting and boosting local green growth, supporting local SMEs, upskilling the supply chain, and removing barriers to suppliers becoming involved in the schemes. What they're looking to achieve from this programme is, demonstrable changes to those 4 points, so that the activity that you develop in terms of your procurement approach, the questions you ask, the requirements that you put on the contractor, the social value and added value approaches that you want, all need to support these key elements to really try and meet the government ambition through the Warm Homes funding. And one of the key elements with this as well is also around the specific requirements of what contractors and clients need to be aware of when they are procuring through Warm Homes funding. So one of the key things is past 2035 and Trustmark. So Trustmark lodgements are a key requirement of the scheme. Non-compliance with Trustmark means that funding may be clawed back, and that measure will be deemed ineligible through the grant funding, and the organisation will have to fully fund it, which would obviously have contractual implications for the contractor who's been delivering that. So in terms of the specific requirements here, we need to, suppliers clearly need to budget for past 2035 requirements and Trustmark lodgement. That's critical in terms of delivery of quality. You may have seen last week there was an announcement from the government around some quality standards on Eco4 GBIS schemes, where a number of installers have actually been expelled from the scheme in the short term, and until they can demonstrate that they've got the quality systems in place to demonstrate they can deliver public funded money for retrofit suitably. So this is going to become more and more relevant as we go through. So in terms of your procurement, in terms of your specifications, you need to make that clear. And in terms of suppliers responding to it, you need to make sure you're really future-proofing yourself for all the additional costs and jobs that you'll need to do associated with this. So that means you need to understand PAS processes and trustmark processes fully, from the start to the end. It can be timely, it can be administration heavy, and it can have a lot of timescales and a lot of delays associated with it. So for grant funded agreements, identifying PAS and lodgement will be critical. And that will probably come through in terms of KPIs and service level agreements. But you need to consider what is a suitable service level agreement. If you as a client are saying we want the contractor to lodge completed works with Trustmark within 20 days of the handover of the completed property, are those service level agreements realistic for the contractor? Is that going to add extra cost? Is it going to be completely unachievable and then result in, clawback potentially by, results not being achieved in a timely manner? So it's about working with the supply chain here and working with clients, having those informed discussions to understand what is realistic before pen's put to paper, so everyone's delivering something that's beneficial to the overall programme. And the other side of this is audits and reporting. So all of the government funded schemes, regardless of whether it's domestic public sector, non-domestic public sector, they all require monitoring and reporting. So audits are required on all aspects of the projects to ensure quality fraud prevention. Procurement isn't an exception to the cause, and that's also subject to audit. So again, the regulations, your own standing orders are there as part of your procurement teams, but you do need to make sure you've got everything crossed and dotted so you can demonstrate, with full hand on heart that you've met all the regulations, and that there's going to be no audit implications for you when it comes to demonstrating why you're working with John Smith Plumbers from down the road, for example. And in terms of reporting, there will be elements throughout the scheme where key reporting on procurement activity is going to have to be reported on. From an installer, they're going to have to report on all the activity that's been delivered on the ground. And so again, it's about making clear at the start in terms of what those requirements are so they can be priced in. Reporting for different milestones and different achievements might not be something that a contractor is used to doing. If they've just been delivering works in the private sector, they might not need to worry about reporting on KPI 5, 6 and 7. And reporting on KPI 5, 6 and 7 might take 2 hours a time. So someone's got to cover the cost for that. So it's about making sure everything's upfront, so everyone's got the knowledge and the ability to price fairly and deliver it effectively. So that kind of gets us to the end of the main procurement focus. So we've got some other RISE materials, and we've got some other materials coming online very shortly. So in terms of masterclasses, we've got Procuring for Retrofit with Chic Masterclass. That is a Niall Rogers and Chic. That is a Chic who I've forgotten the acronym for, which I'll have to look after this. We've got Procurement, Sustainable Procurement in the UK Housing and Retrofit Industry Masterclass, and Embedding Sustainability in Procurement Practices. We've also got a couple of toolkits and advice packs. We're going to be launching an advice pack next week on the Procurement Act. So a lot of what we've talked about today will be there in narrative form. But there is some information out there already on the government portal, and obviously you'll start to find this coming out much more prominently into the market over the next couple of weeks as that February date draws nearer. We've got a few more supply chain events on the radar. So we've got Trustmark and MCS requirements coming up next week, and then the week after that we've got working with housing providers. So this is something very much for supply chain contractors who are new to working in public funded retrofit and working in the domestic market, in terms of the nuances of working with housing associations and local authorities. And we've got a lot more content coming out throughout the year. Obviously, we're going to start seeing contracts moving forward to grant funding agreements. So as we get to that point, we'll start to deliver much more niche subject areas to support both clients and supply chain in terms of specific requirements around procurement, around contract management and specifications. Thank you, Sam, for digging me out of that one. I was regretting my Niall Rogers joke then when it backfired on me. So, but yeah, you've saved me on that one. So thanks for that. And we do have a new CPD accredited resident engagement bootcamp. So again, I imagine a lot of people on this call are fake with resident engagement, but it might be, as a client, as a housing association, a local authority, you want to know more, or you've got teams, or as a supply chain, you're thinking, I need to understand, why housing associations ask me about resident engagement all the time. So, if you want to attend one of these, you'll find out a lot more about the key successes, challenges, and solutions to effective resident engagement, which is everybody's responsibility when delivering retrofit. It doesn't just sit with one person.